next speaker is Chris Weeks also from Michigan State University, speaking on the Michigan NetPen Experience Part 1.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about the rise and fall of netpen aquaculture in Michigan. Hey, and these are the co-authors. Ron, do you recognize any of these guys? Okay, that's pretty good. I did this because I wanted to kind of make the point that when you come out and weigh against something very controversial in extension, chances are you're going to be accused of advocating. Jim kind of pointed that out yesterday. Certainly that was the case for Michigan. So we're talking about Michigan. Michigan's handprint sits within 6 quadrillion gallons of water, 11,000 miles of coastline, high quality water. It's perfect for freshwater aquaculture. In fact, the potential for it is really unimaginable. Somewhere in this portion, there are 7 locations in Ontario that grow rainbow trout sustainably along the coastlines, such as Northwind's Fishery. This facility here produces 500,000 pounds of rainbow trout a year. Takes about 18 months from egg to 2 kilograms. These fish are processed in Canada, shipped into the United States, and sold all across Michigan in major grocery stores such as Myers and Kroger. They're priced very competitively with Atlantic salmon. This is a snapshot of Ontario industry. They're growing about 12 to 15% in volume and value over the last 3 years. A large portion of that is from rainbow trout, large economic contribution, $100 million, and a large number of jobs. On a scale basis, Ontario fisheries, about 500,000 pounds, will fit in 1 marina in Michigan and in most of the Great Lakes. And this is just 1 marina of several in most of the major portions across the Great Lakes. So this story kind of starts with the Michigan Aquaculture Development Act, 1996. What it did, it was thought as a big win at the time. I know there was some people in here that were part of that. It defined aquaculture in Michigan as agriculture. However, it also defined aquaculture as a commercial entity, and that a farm had to operate in privately controlled waters, which is water controlled within any structure or leased by an aquaculturist. Now these come into play when it comes into the netpen experience. So I was sitting in my office one day in October 2014 contemplating the release of the Michigan Aquaculture Strategic Plan. And Jim mentioned yesterday, we had a stakeholder forecasting exercise, and it identified that we have potential for a $1 billion industry through these flow-through ROS and netpens. Well, this has never been talked about in Michigan before. And so all of a sudden it started a wave of concern amongst various entities. December 2014, there were 2 proposals sent into the state. One was, I have the little stars up there. You can't see it, but little Bay de Noc up here. 2 facilities, 380,000 pounds out of that facility. 1 in Alpena area, 500,000 pounds. At least one of them offered to pay all the monitoring, all the research and stuff for an adaptive management framework. It was pretty quiet after that. We didn't hear anything about these proposals coming from the state. It seemed like the state really didn't know what to do with these proposals. So Ron and I got together, sitting in the office occasionally, and started taking inventory of what we have in terms of support. We had roughly 0.6 FTEs at MSU and across the state. We had maybe 2 or 3 industry people that are really for it, a couple economic development people. We had Farm Bureau. Overall, we had about 10 people that thought netpen was probably a good thing to really start working on. So finally in May 2015, we heard through the media that the state was forming a scientific panel to kind of look at the economic or the environmental impacts of it. In June 2015, one state agency, which I'm not going to mention here, had a presentation to various fishery advisory groups. And this was significant because these fishery advisory groups were part of the Charter Boat and other fishery groups that were heavily in opposition against anything in the Great Lakes as far as aquaculture. I didn't really know this presentation existed till 2015. So in this presentation, my understanding is that this information was pulled out of this strategic plan, and that there were going to be 500 net pens across the lakes in Michigan, or 500 acres needed for 250 operations for 1 million pounds of each facility. Now, being the PI in this project, I did not know where it really surprised me because I didn't know where this information came from. So in fact, there were 2 places in the entire 100-page plus document where we even talked about where this production might be. And to be honest, I was really concerned about this aspect because I wanted to make sure we did not say where this production was going to go across species, and frankly, we really had no idea how to get to $1 billion. So one of them was this figure 7, and it was a hypothetical situation. And I saw this and I said, yeah, we better do something about it. So we put in this caveat to explain that it's not all from netpen where this is going to come from. But even if you draw a line through this and to show where the trout production would be, we're talking about $275 million, $2 a pound, so that's 137, not 250 million pounds. And one other spot we talked about trout production, and that's where we talked about maybe on replacing the imports that were coming from Ontario, which was only $40 million. So that's the only place we saw this. Then the presentation, the very next slide, talked about, well, each one of these facilities is going to put 20,000 pounds of phosphorus annually in, and then they equated it to 2.8 million people. Well, first of all, 20,000 pounds at a million pounds facility, that's 2% phosphorus, which made absolutely no sense whatsoever. In fact, if you do the math, that would require a feed conversion rate of 4.4. Well, the feed conversion rate is actually about 1.2. So pretty simple math. That number is completely wrong. And so 250 is wrong, 2,000 pounds of phosphorus is wrong. So essentially what we're looking at, this slide has no basis whatsoever for this presentation. Just to show how easy it is to do the math, I did it on spreadsheet very quickly. So in June 2015, we heard that the science panel was now formed. Jim Diana was on it. We had some very great people on there, very good requirements. Anderson, Detmers, Diana, James Morris. The supporters were kind of hopeful here because we thought that science would win out. We would have good argument. In August 2015, we organized a meeting of stakeholders up in St. Ignace. We looked at all the topics of concern, and what we did is we had a panel format, a facilitator for each topic. We had 2 opposing views, 2 supporting views. We had over 100 in attendance, thought it went really well, thought we explained a whole lot. And then the public statements and resolutions against netpen aquaculture started coming out. And this was a very broad-based, a very strong political force, overwhelming kind of situation we found ourselves in. Their main concerns were the typical diseases, solids built up, antibiotic use, escapes, genetics. I think a lot of these we could easily explain, and we did attempt to do that through science. However, I think where we had a hard time is talking about the fate of phosphorus through netpen aquaculture. You can have all the science in the world, but who the heck is going to listen when you got Lake Erie turning into toxic algae bloom that's poisoning the water of Toledo? So this is where we kind of struggle. So coming to public forums, I made some kind of comments. There's a better question to ask. Can we manage our resources so that we can both grow sustainable seafood that's healthy, but also provide a good fishery? So if you take a look at the phosphorus objectives for Lake Huron and Georgia Bay, I think these are in the Water Quality Pact. They want 5 micrograms per liter. That's the target. In 2009, there was a caution going on because they were too low. Essentially what we're looking at, these waters are ultra-oligotrophic. We have problems. Our salmon fishery has collapsed in Lake Huron, and it's likely to follow suit. One thing about this is the lake trout population is coming back, but certainly the salmon is. Another concern is the whitefish fishery. That's kind of showing follows the same thing as the salmon fishery. So there might be opportunities here to work with these partners. When these arguments were made, one argument, not necessarily argument, when these observations were kind of pointed out, there was an argument that brought against it by a scientist that said, well, it's the phosphorus shunt cycle. It doesn't matter. All what phosphorus shunt cycle is that the quagga mussels are basically filtering out the particulate phosphorus. Reactive phosphorus is turning into phosphorus that's available for algae and turning it to the toxic algae. So problems with the phosphorus cycle concept, it's a conceptual model only. It does not account for these SPADs, which are essentially areas where these fish can really high productivity of fishery cycles. And so that's one of the things we're dealing with. In the summer of 2015, we started hearing a lot of public media attention that were coming out in opposition, and essentially they kind of changed their tactics, said we're not opposing aquaculture, but we know that aquaculture can be done, but it can be done indoors, it can be done in Michigan. Some legislation started coming out. Senate Bill 526 basically would have shut down, would have prohibited all aquaculture operations whose discharges go into the Great Lakes. And this is probably my favorite media bite of the whole time, made by the senator, my senator in fact, against netpen operations. What this bill would have done was shut down all facilities that would have gone into the Great Lakes. And so if we take a look at all the hatcheries that grow over 1,000 pounds, we have state hatcheries and their netpen operation. But if we recall, aquaculture is defined as a commercial entity. So the only thing that would have been left from Senate Bill 526 would have been the state hatchery system. Science reports started coming out. We had a series of reports. Science report, regulatory analysis, what environmental potentially at risk report. Essentially what they looked at was either the $2, the $4, or the $7 billion economic contribution that the Great Lakes offer against the economic impact report, which was only 2 facilities. And there's also industry performance. So much effort went into this, just stemming from this identification of netpens. This is when the Attorney General came out and said that, well, Great Lakes are not privately controlled waters, therefore the facility can't be registered. In November 2015, we had opportunity for public comment, and this is the way it came out. We had over 1,700 written comments went into the state, 1,600 in opposition, 11 in support. Probably a couple of those were from people in this room. 90% of those were electronic form letter through Food and Water Watch, and the wave just got bigger and bigger. More legislation came out that would help netpen, pave the way. This was a green light for netpen aquaculture. I was contacted to help look over the language on this, and essentially my comment to them was, look, we have a red light with the 526. This is a total green light. My recommendation, well, why don't we try for a yellow light? Well, this was ignored by the bill supporters, and it went through. January 26th, even more legislation, which was a correction of the Jones bill to allow some of these facilities to still continue to go. And what we heard later was this epic MRA poll. Essentially what they did was they did a poll, do you support aquaculture in the Great Lakes? 17% said yes, 56% no. Then they had some opposing statements. What this kind of showed was that the opposition statements were very dramatic. Again, it was all concerned about the putting the $7 billion aquaculture at risk. February 2016, the debate's picking up on both sides of the legislation, and then wham, the Flint water crisis. Essentially, that was it. I mean, there was no further going forward at this point. In March 2016, the state came out with their synthesis report, Jim went over that. I won't go over it, but basically the state said it's going to cost us $3 million to get into this program and $2.33 million a year to do it. It's not worth the public investment for a $10 million two-facility industry. In June 2016, probably a little late in the game, there was we took legislators and stakeholders, including some of the others, up on a netpen tour. This is the report that came out of this. What we did find is that First Nations partnerships were part of the growing part of that, and that sport fishing is enhanced by the netpen operators. Essentially, the netpens and the recreational and sport fishermen and commercial fishermen in Ontario have a benefit relationship. So since then, sitting on the office, it's been really quiet. Then Jim talked about the federal legislation that was recently proposed. That doesn't look to be going anywhere. Rumor has it from others that maybe it was a publicity stunt. I don't think there are any other co-sponsors on that bill right now. And with that, that's the end of part 1.